This state court in Colorado that is filled with seven Supreme Court justices, all of whom are appointed by Democratic Party governors. Colorado is a very blue state. They are governed by Democratic governors. These Democratic governors pick Democratic Party judges to fill the entire Colorado state judiciary with, including the Colorado Supreme Court. All seven of them are Democratic judges, and 4 out of the 7 ruled that Trump is ineligible or disqualified from appearing on the Colorado ballot by virtue of the fact that he's ineligible to assume the presidency, given that he is guilty of insurrection, a crime for which he has never been charged. Here's the New York Times report on it today. Trump is disqualified from 2024 ballot. Colorado court says an explosive ruling. Quote, the decision, the first by a court to find that Donald Trump is ineligible to hold office again because he engaged in insurrection, is likely to put a monumental case before the U.S. Supreme Court. The Colorado Supreme Court was the first in the nation to find that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which disqualifies people who engage in insurrection against the Constitution after taking an oath to support it, applies to Mr. Trump, an argument that his opponents have been making around the country. The ruling directs the Colorado Secretary of State to exclude Mr. Trump's name from the state's Republican primary ballot. It does not address the general election. Now, the only people who have standing to bring this case in Colorado are Republican voters or independent voters, namely people eligible to vote in the primary. And they go to court and they say, our rights as electorates would be compromised or violated if someone appears on the ballot who's ineligible to be president, and this is Donald Trump. So nominally, the case was brought in the name of a few Republican voters, a few independent voters who hate Trump. The reality, though, these cases are being spearheaded by a liberal advocacy group called CREW. And here is the president of CREW, Noah Bookbinder, who was very eager to take credit for this decision. Quote, we just won before the Colorado Supreme Court in our challenge to keep Donald Trump off the ballot as disqualified under the 14th Amendment for engaging in insurrection. A huge moment for democracy. More to come soon. This makes me physically sick. They are claiming endlessly for years now that only they are the guardians of American democracy, that American democracy is under existential threat from Donald Trump. And therefore, everything they do, censoring the internet, trying to imprison Trump, putting his supporters in jail, keeping them in solitary confinement for months, criminalizing the Trump movement by calling it an insurrectionary movement, and now we're trying to remove him from the ballot so voters can't vote for him. That somehow is not an attack on democracy, which of course it is, but a vindication of democracy. This is a huge moment for democracy. To remove the person more people want to be president than anyone else from the presidential ballot. This is something that when Vladimir Putin does, when he imprisons Viktor Navalny, even though Putin is way more popular in Russia than Navalny, we say, oh, Russian democracy is a fraud. Putin imprisons his main ally, his main opponent, and doesn't allow him to run. This is what the Egyptian dictator that the United States supports, General Sisi, they just had an election there. He won re-election with 92% of the vote because no one can run against him who has any meaningful voice with the people. They go to prison, they're killed. This is what every country we accuse of being anti-democratic does, that the United States is now doing. And it's being spearheaded by this group. The district court case in November actually rejected the petition to remove Trump, but only after ruling against him on every last issue. So here is that district court ruling from November 17th. It didn't get a lot of media attention because it refused to remove Trump from the ballot, but it completely contaminated this case and showed what Democratic Party judges are willing to do. Here's part of what she wrote, quote, the court further concludes that the events on and around January 6, 2021 easily satisfy the definition of an insurrection. You're talking about a 2-hour riot by people, none of whom wielded guns, inside the Capitol. And remember, the only people who died on that day, on January 6, were 4 Trump supporters, one of whom, Ashley Babbitt, was shot by the police, the Capitol Hill police. Two of whom died of heart attacks because they really hadn't left their couch in a long time and were very unhealthy. The idea that they were going to lead some sort of insurrection against the most militarized government in the history of the world is a complete and utter joke. And then another who died of a speed overdose. All Trump supporters died on January 6th. Of course, they lied continuously. The media did, as we covered extensively at the time, by claiming that the Trump protesters bashed the head in of a Capitol Hill police officer with a fire extinguisher and murdered him, when the autopsy found that he didn't die on January 6th, but January 7th, and he died of natural causes. He didn't even go to the hospital. He called his parents that night and said he was fine. So there were police who were injured, but the only people who died on this day were 4 Trump supporters. And yet this judge says it clearly, easily satisfies the definition of an insurrection. Quote, in the context of Trump's speech as a whole, as well as the broader context of Trump's efforts to inflame his supporters through outright lies of voter fraud in the weeks leading up to January 6th, and his longstanding pattern of encouraging political violence among his supporters, the court finds that his call on that day to, quote, fight and, quote, fight like hell, was intended as and was understood by a portion of the crowd as a call to arms. Saying we have to fight like hell, she said, was such a obviously explicit call to violence that it removed the speech from the protected grounds of the First Amendment. She went on, these findings support the conclusion that President Trump's calls for imminent lawlessness and violence during his speech were likely to incite such imminent lawlessness and violence. That's the phrase that the U.S. Supreme Court used in Brandenburg for the only kind of political speech that falls outside of First Amendment protection, inciting imminent lawless violence. When President Trump told his supporters that they were, quote, allowed to go by very different rules and that if they did not quite fight, quote, fight like hell, they would not, quote, have a country anymore, it was likely that his supporters would heed his encouragement and act violently. We therefore hold that this final prong of the Brandenburg test, meaning to remove a political speech from the protections of political speech, have been met. In sum, we conclude that President Trump's speech on January 6th was not protected by the First Amendment. Now, we're going to show you what Trump actually said about violence. The only thing he said about violence was don't use it, be peaceful. But the Brandenburg court has always said you're allowed to even advocate violence as long as it's not designed to incite imminent violence, meaning you have a crowd gathered and you tell it to go burn a house down. So, again, if you want to accuse Trump of being an insurrectionist, charge him with that crime. But that's not what this court did. Quote, in this court's view, there is a difference between the secretary having the authority to prohibit a candidate from being put on the ballot based on what Ms. Rudy described as an objective knowable fact, and prohibiting a candidate from being put on a ballot due to potential constitutional infirmity that has yet to either be determined by either a court or Congress. So this is the key point, which is obviously Trump has not been charged with an insurrection, with the crime of insurrection. And that's the argument he made. He never had a trial on that. And the response of those trying to keep him off the ballot were, well, there's other constitutional requirements. For example, you can't run for president if you're younger than 35 years of age, or you can't become president if you're younger than 35. You can't serve more than 2 terms. So they were saying, well, if somebody comes here and tries to get on the ballot and they're under 35, or they've already served 2 terms like President Obama or President Bush, we wouldn't wait for a trial. Of course we would be able to tell them that they can't be on the ballot. And this is the one point where the court is saying that there's a difference between something so obvious like age or how many terms you've served as president, where you're obviously ineligible, and a complex question like whether someone's guilty of an insurrection. And she's pointing out that there's a difference between an objective, knowable fact, such as the age, and prohibiting a candidate from being put on the ballot due to potential constitutional infirmity that has yet to be determined by either a court or a Congress. In other words, the question of whether Trump actually engaged in an insurrection is not one that has been determined. It's not obvious, like someone's age or how many terms they've served. And therefore, they said, quote, the court holds that the secretary cannot, on her own accord, keep a candidate from appearing on the ballot based on a constitutional infirmity unless that constitutional infirmity is an objective, knowable fact. Here, whether Trump is disqualified under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is not an objective, knowable fact. While the court agrees that the secretary cannot investigate and adjudicate Trump's eligibility, the election code gives this court that authority. So she's saying the Secretary of State can't determine if Trump was an insurrectionist, but I'm the court. I can determine that. And that's when she went on to say that he is guilty of an insurrection, even though he hasn't had a trial. So again, everything she's ruling against Trump, his speech was outside of the First Amendment. He is an insurrectionist under the 14th Amendment. And the only ruling that she issued that caused her to reject this petition to remove him was for Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to apply to Trump, this court must find both that the presidency is an office under the United States and that Trump took an oath as an officer of the United States to support the Constitution. The court holds there is scant direct evidence regarding whether the presidency is one of the positions subject to disqualification. The disqualified offices enumerated are presented in descending order, starting with the highest levels of the federal government and descending downward. It starts with senator or representatives, then lists electors of presidents and vice presidents, and then ends with the catch-all phrase, any office, civil or military, under the United States. To lump the presidency in with any other civil or military office is odd indeed and very troubling to the court, because as Trump points out, Section 3 explicitly lists all the federal elected positions except president and vice president. The court holds that it is unpersuaded that the drafters intended to include the highest office in the country in the catch-all phrase, office under the United States. So that is the only reason that November ruling didn't remove Trump from the ballot. But it issued all kinds of damning findings against Trump. And it was a judge who was so obviously biased against him. You couldn't find a more flagrant Democratic Party activist or liberal activist than this judge. She donated money to a resistance group right before she became a judge. It's almost certain that the only media outlets she watches are the ones that constantly drum into people's head that Trump is an insurrectionist. And the way courts work is that when you go to a court in the first instance and there's a trial or a hearing of some kind, what the judge finds factually is really not reversible by the Supreme Court. They can reverse it on abuse of discretion grounds if it's very clearly wrong, but in general, they give deference to those findings. The only thing a Supreme Court will really reverse from a lower court is a legal conclusion. And that is exactly what this Supreme Court did on a 4-3 ruling. 4 judges said this judge below was right about everything. The only thing she got wrong was this legal conclusion that president and vice president are not included in the 14th Amendment prohibition against running if you did an insurrection. We reverse her on that. We find the 14th Amendment does apply to the president, and therefore Trump is banned from the ballot. So here's the ruling. It's Anderson versus Griswold is the name of the case, and this was from yesterday. And here's the summary of what the Supreme Court, 4 judges on the Supreme Court, the 3 judges in dissent all wrote separate opinions. We're just going to show you a small part of those because the key point they emphasize is the one that I've been emphasizing, which is that Trump has never been charged with this crime that they're using to say that he should be disqualified. There's no due process to call him an insurrectionist. But here's what the Colorado Supreme Court said, these 4 judges in the majority. Quote, in this appeal from a district court proceeding under the Colorado Election Code, The Supreme Court considers whether former President Donald J. Trump may appear on the Colorado Republican presidential primary ballot in 2024. A majority of the court holds that President Trump is disqualified from holding the office of president under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Because he is disqualified, it would be a wrongful act under the election code for the Colorado Secretary of State to list him as a candidate on the presidential primary ballot. The court stays its ruling until January 4th, 2024, subject to any further appellate proceedings, meaning to allow the Supreme Court to intervene. Now, I want to bring up a tweet, I don't know if we have it, of an analysis of who these 7 judges of the Supreme Court are. And actually they're all Democrats, but the key point, and I'll just explain this to you, was made by Jason Willey, the Washington Post columnist, who's actually quite a good and objective columnist. And he made a very interesting point, which is that all 7 judges on the Colorado Supreme Court are obviously Democrats. It's a very blue state. They were appointed by Democratic governors. 4 of them went to Ivy League schools, Yale, Penn, Harvard, and 3 of them went to the University of Denver Law School. So they're all Democrats. You can't say the 4-3 ruling broke down on party lines because there are no party lines. It's a fully Democratic court. The way it broke down was the 4 judges who removed Trump from the ballot all went to Ivy League schools. The 3 judges who dissented and said the court has no right to remove Trump all went to the University of Denver Law School. And I think the reason why that's so interesting and important is because this is something we've been pounding for a long time, which is what's really going on in the United States and the broader Western world, is that when 2016 happened and British voters enacted Brexit and left the EU, a huge shock to the Western establishment. And then 4 months later, they had the biggest shock of all, which is that Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton to become president of the United States. Western elites went into a panic, and they concluded that they can no longer trust their populations to be free, to have free speech, to vote freely in elections, because when they do, they make the wrong choices. And they need to be controlled, they need to be guided. That's when this whole disinformation industry emerged, funded by billionaires and security state agencies, where all of these people from colleges proclaimed themselves disinformation experts out of nowhere and started to decree what was true and false for people so that we could remove false ideas from the internet so that people weren't contaminated and misled by them anymore. They only would get elite approved views over the internet. That's what the censorship regime is about. That really emerged after 2016. And now this attempt to put Donald Trump in prison or remove him from the ballot. This is a very elite idea, the idea that the peasants cannot be trusted to be free. And so it's not surprising to me that the division here was between people educated at Ivy League schools on the East Coast and people who went to their local law school in Colorado at the University of Denver. That was the breakdown. Now, here's what the court said. We hold as follows. And I'm just going to show you the part that differed from the lower court ruling that enabled them to reverse that lower court ruling and to remove Trump from the ballot. Quote, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment encompasses the office of the presidency and someone who has taken an oath as president. On this point, the district court committed reversible error. And then they went on to just affirm and accept every other finding of the district court since it was all against Trump. The district court did not abuse its discretion in admitting portions of the January 6th report into evidence at trial. The district court did not err in concluding that the events at the Capitol on January 6th constituted an insurrection. The district court did not err in concluding that President Trump, quote, engaged in that insurrection through his personal actions. President Trump's speech inciting the crowd that breached the U.S. Capitol on January 6th was not protected by the First Amendment. I mean, this is a very dangerous ruling because of how much it erodes core free speech protections under the First Amendment to find that Trump's January 6th speech is outside the bounds of the Brandenburg protection. And that this 2 or 3 hour riot was an insurrection, an intended insurrection that Trump himself incited and instigated, despite not being charged with it. What would stop a Republican judge from going and taking all the members of Congress over the years, the Democratic members of Congress, who have objected to the certification of presidential elections, declaring them insurrectionists without any trial or criminal proceeding or due process, and ordering them removed from the ballot or from Congress on the grounds that the court finds they're insurrectionists? Nothing. Liberals in the United States really do see Trump as a Hitler figure. And if you really see Trump as a Hitler figure, which I promise you they do, they talk themselves into that every day, even though he was president for 4 years and didn't do the hallmark Hitlerian things like invading other countries for conquest or setting up death camps for dissidents and minority groups, just little things like that that Trump didn't do over 4 years. They still are convinced, no, this time he's really going to be Hitler. And if you believe that, and they do, they're not just pretending, they really believe that, they believe this for a long time, you are going to resort to things like this to keep Hitler out of power and to keep Biden in power, because you believe that's the only way to save American democracy, is if you override American democracy to do it. This court ruling it's such a disgrace. It is such a fraud. Even 3 Democratic members of the court said that. Here's what the court went on to say, quote, "The Constitution delegates to states the authority to prescribe the time, place, and manner of holding congressional elections, and states retain the power to regulate their own elections. But does the U.S. Constitution authorize states to assess the constitutional qualifications of presidential candidates? We conclude that it does." Now, there was a case back in 1868, Griffin's case, that actually decided this issue. And they essentially decided in a way that would have precluded the court from removing Trump from the ballot. And listen to what they do with the Supreme Court case from 1868 to get rid of it, just to say we're not following it. Quote, "Griffin's case concludes that congressional action is needed before Section 3 disqualification attaches." That's what that Supreme Court ruling said, that if someone is disqualified under the 14th Amendment, you need a congressional action to remove them. That's what the Supreme Court said in 1868. So this court says, but that one case does not persuade us of that point. It's a Supreme Court case. Trump and his allies assert that Griffin's case, quote, "remains good law and has been repeatedly relied on. Because the case is not binding on us, the fact that it has not been reversed is of no particular significance. And the cases that cite it do so either with no analysis, it's a Supreme Court case, we're not bound by it, it's not a very good case, most cases don't even respect it that much, so we don't care, we're not going to follow that." Then they say, quote, "We do not place the same weight the district court did on the fact that the presidency is not specifically mentioned in Section 3. It seems most likely that the presidency is not specifically included because it so evidently is an office." Here's where they're saying why the lower court was wrong in the one thing she ruled in Trump's favor on. Quote, "We do not place the same weight that the district court did on the fact that the presidency is not specifically mentioned in Section 3. It seems most likely that the presidency is not specifically included because it is so evidently an office." Do you see how they're going out of their way to just throw away any argument that stands in the way of what they want to do? Honestly, when I went to law school, I was very excited. I was so passionate about the law. And when I got to law school, I worked at a very big Wall Street firm. And I decided I was going to go there for as long as I could stand it, just to learn everything I could about the law. It was a very good law firm filled with extremely smart people. It was the law firm where George Conway, Kellyanne Conway's husband, was a partner. A lot of other very well-connected people. It was a very smart law firm. They were defending Goldman Sachs and insurance companies. I knew I didn't want to be doing that with my life. So I wanted to go and absorb everything I could about the law and then start my own law firm, which I did, and it grew. And we represented a lot of people. But the main reason why I grew tired of the law is because this is what judges do. They just cheat all the time to get the outcome they want. I saw it worked in my favor sometimes. It worked against me sometimes. But judges are a joke. Not all of them, but many of them. And you see them here just throwing away precedent that they don't want to deal with. Trying to get around the fact that the 14th Amendment lists all these other offices, but doesn't list president and vice president. And just ignoring the fact that even though Trump was never charged with being an insurrectionist, they have to claim he is one to get this ruling that they want. 4 Democratic judges from the Ivy League schools wanting to prevent the American people from a free choice in this election. That's what this is. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.